Hi, it's Rebecca here on Reading the Pattern, and this is a video I've been giving a lot of thought to doing for a while now, and it's finally time, as I keep getting more and more comments that make me want to open up this topic here. So I want to talk about fan reactions to castings in the Wheel of Time, including my own, and especially why our reactions are often so emotional and why that can make it difficult for us to discuss controversial topics rationally. But this is a tough one, so for whatever good it may do, I hope we can keep in mind that these are challenging things to talk about, and I hope that there are ways that we can encourage constructive dialogue even when we disagree. So to start with, and to be upfront, I will let you know that my reactions to the castings in general have been that I love them, and I'm so excited to see what these actors will do with characters that I love and have spent so much time with. I am trying to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible, with the exception of some appearance descriptions of some characters and cultures. But at one point in the video, I will spoil a reveal from the end of book 1. I'll warn you right before that happens so you can skip that part if you haven't finished through book 1. For me, the number one reason why I am personally so excited about each of the major castings has to do with what Rafe Judkins, the showrunner, has had to say about each actor. For anyone who doesn't know, Rafe Judkins, the showrunner himself, is a really big fan of the Wheel of Time books. So when he says an actor really understands a character, that carries a lot of weight for me. Now, I don't happen to be someone who typically has a really strong mental image of a character when I read. If I've seen a lot of fan art and the art is really consistent, I might start to be influenced by that. Or if the cover art happens to be really good, I might go by that. But sadly for the Wheel of Time, that is not always the case for the original covers.
For instance, maybe we shouldn't consider anyone in authority who thinks that Perrin looks like this, or this.
Now, for people who do typically have really strong mental images, I get that it can be an adjustment to get used to any actor in a role, because chances are they're not going to look like how you pictured them. I also realize that what I'm looking for in casting might be different from someone else. So to be upfront again, what matters most to me is not that an actor happened to match exactly an image I have in my head, or even that they match as closely as possible to a description in the books, which often leaves a lot to the imagination. What matters to me is, can an actor capture the essence of the character through their acting? When I think about some of my favorite castings from Game of Thrones, for example, I don't really think the actors match the book descriptions. Sean Bean as Ned Stark doesn't look exactly the way he's described. His hair color is different, for instance. But could anyone have been better or have brought more attention to the show in season 1? And then you have Peter Dinklage and Gwendolyn Christie, who literally only match the character descriptions for Tyrion and Brienne in terms of height. But they're both incredible, and I wouldn't have anyone else in those roles. Hopefully, when we see the actors bring the characters in the Wheel of Time to life, we're going to feel the same. So let's take a look at a fairly uncontroversial casting choice in the Wheel of Time TV show. And that's the very first and biggest casting announcement for Rosamund Pike as Moiraine.
The most notable difference between Moiraine and Rosamund is that Moiraine is repeatedly described as very short and petite, whereas Rosamund is 5'8.5". In other words, fairly tall for a woman.
But what else does Rosamund bring to the table? She is a very well-known and well-respected actress who's been nominated for and won numerous awards and has a resume that shows her range.
And then, according to Rafe Judkins, she is deeply invested in the source material and knows the character, quote, in her bones.
So would I be willing to risk giving up any of these amazing attributes in the hopes of finding a different actress who had all of these things and happened to be petite? Personally, I wouldn't, because in the end, the height of this character just doesn't impact the storyline. I'll use another example, and in this case, it's one that actually initially gave me some pause, and that's Alvaro Morte for the role of Logain. Now, for those of us in the English-speaking world, we might have been a little bit less familiar with Alvaro Morte, but he's actually a very well-known and popular actor in the Spanish-speaking world and is especially loved for his role as the professor in Money Heist. The reason I was a little concerned is that Alvaro is 44 years old and his character Logain is supposed to be in his 20s.
Normally, I would care about an age difference about as much as I care about a height difference, which is not at all. But in this case, there is a story reason why it would be very unlikely for Logain to be in his 40s.
Then I remembered that casting older actors to play younger roles is pretty much a time-honored tradition, and just because Alvaro is in his 40s doesn't mean Logain is going to be. And casting a very popular Spanish actor might actually be a really huge boon to the show. So in the end, I love this casting as well. Now, I've been easing you in here a little bit, talking about height and age, and to be fair, some people really do care about those things. But the heart of this issue is the reaction to the racial diversity in the casting thus far, and this is where things get difficult, so stick with me. I personally put out a video a while back that in part celebrated the racial diversity of the world of the Wheel of Time and the cast thus far. But there are some fans who disagree with me that the world of the Wheel of Time was written to be diverse. Or at least they disagree about the core cast of characters that we're introduced to in book 1, and they believe that those characters were explicitly written to be white. This has been a really hot topic in the Wheel of Time community for several months now. And I've come to realize that both sides often try to use facts and logics to support their point of view, but we often fail to acknowledge the emotional side of why people react the way they do, and why facts often fail to change people's minds. So now that I've told you that facts probably won't change your mind, I'm still going to briefly give you some facts for the sake of covering all of my bases here. So, character descriptions in the Wheel of Time frequently don't mention skin tone at all. Instead, we are often given the few most defining characteristics of a character, and those features are repeated to us again and again. For instance, Egwene is known for being short and having large, dark eyes. Rand is known for being tall, having red hair and light eyes. Perrin has broad shoulders, and Nynaeve has a long, dark braid. Tom has white mustaches. Lan has angular planes on his face and gray at his temples. The Two Rivers folk in general are described as being dark of hair and eye. Rand stands out, especially for his light eyes, and in fact, he thinks to himself that he's never seen another person with blue eyes. Their skin tones can be inferred kind of indirectly from several book passages. So when Rand and Mat first arrive in a big city, Rand notices that there are people with both much darker and much lighter skin tones than he is used to seeing. Add to this, when another character is questioning whether Rand is really from the Two Rivers, she pulls up the sleeve on his arm, looks at his lighter skin underneath the sleeve, and remarks that Two Rivers folk rarely have such skin. Later on, Egwene is described as having much darker than usual skin from spending a lot of time in the sun. All of these put together, to me, suggest that the Two Rivers folk are supposed to have medium-range skin tones. Now, if you didn't happen to notice these minor description details when you were reading 14 books packed with detailed descriptions, I wholeheartedly pardon you. If instead you were more influenced by cover art, fan art, and your own mental images, I think that is totally normal. But to me, the descriptions of dark eyes, dark hair, and medium-range skin tones pretty much leaves open the possibility of casting any race for these characters. I would argue that there are reasons that no particular race of modern humans is supposed to be an exact match for any culture in the Wheel of Time.
On this point, I always think of the Aiel, who are described as often red-haired, always light-eyed, and with skin that is very darkened by the sun, although paler where not exposed to the sun.
Not a genetic combination we see often in modern humans, but we have to cast modern humans. So I believe that in any particular instance, whatever race we choose is at best going to be an approximation. And with that in mind, I would argue that white is probably not the best approximation we could choose for the Two Rivers folk in general, and here's why. literally none of them, with one notable exception, are supposed to have blue eyes. And I looked into this a little bit because I really didn't know the particulars. It's hard to find reliable information on this topic, but from what I can tell, approximately 22% of the white population in the US had blue eyes as of 2006. And in Northern European countries like Finland and Estonia, the percentage is much higher, as much as 89% of the population with blue eyes. So what's the likelihood that an entirely white population living in relative isolation would not have any blue eyes at all? Not very likely. So I gave you my logic and my facts, but why do I think if you weren't already sympathetic to my point of view, I likely didn't convince you with these? One reason is a very common cognitive bias known as the Backfire Effect. I'll put a link in the description to a video that explains more about what this is, but briefly, the Backfire Effect describes the tendency to reject information that contradicts a belief we already hold strongly. In fact, the stronger and more persistent the arguments are against the belief you already hold, the more likely you are to dig into your original belief. Our brains find ways to fight off this contradictory information, which it perceives as threatening. We do this unconsciously, and so we're not even aware of when we're doing it.
Now, there are probably some people out there who never thought of the Two Rivers characters as anything but white, but when presented with information like I've given you here, we're able to say, I didn't realize that, and accept the new information and move on. For those people, the race of the characters they'd been reading probably wasn't something they were strongly attached to.
But why do some people, maybe even a lot of people, assume that characters are white when they're not explicitly described that way? For starters, whenever book characters aren't given very detailed or explicit descriptions, we all probably have a tendency to have a default mental image. When we happen to notice that characters are very explicitly described as dark-skinned, say with Tuon, for example, in The Wheel of Time, that very frequent and specific description might be enough to overcome our natural mental image. But without that, we're going to tend to revert to whatever our default is. Now, if you happen to live in a white majority area or country, I think there's a good chance that your default mental image will be white, even if you are not white. To use a personal anecdote, my husband is not white, but he had that mental image of the Two Rivers characters as white. And I think that's because he lives and grew up in white majority areas. And he was also influenced by cover art and fan art that was probably based on the same mental default. Now, if you happen to live in a non-white majority country, then maybe your mental default is whatever the majority is instead. But otherwise, unless a description is clearly, explicitly, and repeatedly given as dark-skinned, you're probably going to think white. I've seen this countless times with characters whose skin tone is never mentioned at all. People assume white. Now, that alone doesn't make anybody a bad person. Having that sort of unconscious bias we're not even aware of, it's very normal human behavior. But it's good to become aware of that and to realize how it might affect your expectations. So then the second question is, why are some people so strongly attached to the characters looking a certain way, and especially the mental image they had of their race? For starters, I think if you're paying attention to the casting of the show at this point, you're probably a really big fan of these books. Maybe you've been reading them for decades and the characters in the story mean a lot to you. So I understand having an emotional reaction to it all. My reactions have been emotional, though for the most part thrilled, excited, etc. But there does seem to be this common fear that the show adaptation is not going to get it right. And so any potential change could be seen as a sign that the creative team is going to get it wrong. Personally, I know changes are necessary in any adaptation, and I do welcome seeing a different version of the story that I love, rather than attempting the impossible of not changing anything. But it is easy to say that in the abstract, and maybe it's inevitable that at some point there will be a specific change, maybe big, maybe small, that might be hard for me to adjust to. So I do get that. For anyone who sees themselves in these characters, maybe suddenly seeing them looking differently than you is an adjustment. I would like to think we could get to a point where we could identify with characters, whether we share outward characteristics with them or not, but that's not always the case. And if we look at it from the other side, if you are a member of the many groups who have been historically underrepresented in books, movies, and TV, including women, people of color, LGBTQ, religious minorities, people with disabilities, then you probably know for a long time it's been difficult to find characters from these same groups. And a lot of times when we did see them, they might be stereotypical, token characters, villains, or some other negative portrayal. And if you're not someone who's been underrepresented, then maybe use this experience of how you're feeling in this situation to try to see it from the other side. Try to imagine that you've never seen positive representations of someone like yourself in media, and then what it would mean to see something like that finally. That's why people say representation matters. I'm trying to address this to anyone out there who's genuine, whether you agree with me or not. And it's the internet, so I know there are people out there who are not genuine and are just trying to stir up negativity on purpose. I'm not worried about those people because it doesn't matter what I say or what anyone else says. So there's another point that I've seen made over and over again, and that's that some people will acknowledge that maybe it was okay to cast non-white actors in the Two Rivers roles.
But then the idea that they would cast some darker-skinned actors while also casting Barney Harris, who is white, as Matt, is unforgivable. Completely ruins any believability that they wouldn't all be the same. So I do want to address that point as well.
So I will acknowledge that this part is potentially a change from the books, though I don't find it to be a change from the spirit of the books, and I'll explain that. I also don't find it unbelievable, and I think there are potentially some good reasons for it. Overall, the world of the Wheel of Time is filled with people of a wide variety of skin tones. This is especially seen in every major city and a number of cultures, including the Shanchan. The fact is, the Wheel of Time really doesn't comment on race. There are cultural clashes, but within their world, people don't really seem that interested in skin tone or other physical differences as a way of dividing people. So even if Robert Jordan envisioned the Two Rivers folk specifically to be fairly homogeneous in appearance, having instead a range within this group still seems to fit in with the spirit of his world overall, where race is not the key factor that divides people. The Two Rivers was also not 100% isolated from the outside world. Tar and Ferry certainly mixed with outsiders. Plus, the people were descended from Manetheren, which was once a great city and probably looked like the other heterogeneous great cities that we see in this world. So now I'm going to get into one potentially good reason the show might want to have a mix of races within this group. And it is going to involve talking about a spoiler from the end of book 1. So if you haven't read that far, go ahead and skip to the timestamp I'm putting on the screen. In the books, we don't find out until the end of the Eye of the Worlds that Rand is the Dragon Reborn. It isn't that hard to guess because most of the viewpoints are his, but the fact that he looks different from the other characters in the Two Rivers does play into this. But the early press releases for the show describe Moiraine as the central character and indicate that she's looking for one among 5 young people from the Two Rivers, not just the 3 young men. So this to me suggests the show might be looking to obscure who the Dragon Reborn is a little bit more, and throwing Nynaeve and Egwene into the mix makes that more doable. Now imagine if you're trying to do that, if you have 4 of these main characters and everybody else in the Two Rivers being darker skinned, and Rand is literally the only light-skinned person in that group, might make that reveal a little bit harder to obscure. Another reason, and one that I truly believe to be even more important, is that the show seems to have been open-minded in casting and set about finding the best person for each role. Why do I say this? Multiple mentions of looking across the entire world and at countless tapes, leaks from audition videos that showed a variety in who they looked at for a given role.
A statement from a script with this note: race in the world of Wheel of Time is much less defined than in our world. As much as possible, our cast should look like America will in a few hundred years, a beautiful mix of white, brown, black, and everything in between.
So if they were open to looking at all races whenever possible, and they had an abundance of choices, then they would be able to choose the best person for each role. And if Rafe Judkins has said that Barney Harris is Matt, which he has, then I have to believe he chose right, in that case and in others.
And this doesn't mean they're not considering continuity either. Rafe Judkins also clarified to say that, quote, Faldara will look more East Asian. You'll see plenty of gingers in the waist, etc.
So that's my take, and if you've made it this far with me, I thank you, and I hope that you found something I had to say worthy of consideration. The vast majority of reactions that I've seen from fans show me that most people have great intentions and genuinely want to love the show as much as they love the books, even if they're being cautious and not yet riding the hype train like I am. But these are difficult topics that exist in a lot of fandoms, and I think we should take the opportunity to try to discuss these tough subjects. We can't become better as a fandom and a society if we don't try to have open dialogue. But knowing that videos like this will draw out some negativity, I would certainly appreciate it if you got something worthwhile out of this video, add a like, and share it wherever you interact in the fandom. If you want all manner of Wheel of Time content for the books and the show, check out my other videos and consider subscribing. Peace, favor your swords, and be kind to each other.